Thank you so much for joining us for the Living on Purpose and Not by Accident podcast by Summit Financial Group and Remedy Live. I'm your host, Heather Herron, and I am delighted today to introduce Brandy and Lael Melville, all the way from Texas, right?
Right.
Thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Well, I'm originally from New Jersey. My family is from New Jersey. I had the pleasure of meeting Lael in college, and we've been married now for 37 years. We have 3 boys. Well, I should say, actually, they're young men now. They don't like to me refer to them as boys, but we've had the pleasure of living in different parts of the country, and we currently live in Plano, Texas.
To that, I will add, Randy is the love of my life. He's also my boyfriend, and we get to do life together, and it's a good thing.
That's wonderful. I have gotten to hear a little bit about your story, and you formed a foundation, but let's talk about what it took to get to that foundation and why it was something that was on your heart to form.
Okay. Well, I had the honor of working for a Fortune 23 company for 25 years. And throughout that time, had an opportunity to see virtually every major market in the country. And I became acutely aware of some of the differences across the country as it relates to racial differences that were affected in various communities. As I thought more about what I wanted to do in the second chapter of my life, I began to ask a simple but fundamental question, which is, have I made a difference? Have I made a difference in the community? Have I made a difference in my family? Have I made a difference in my company? Have I really, truly made a difference outside of my workspace? And in truthfulness, I hadn't. And so that then began our journey of thinking about how we wanted to make a difference. And one of the credos that Lael and I live by is, to whom much is given, much is required. That then we did a listening tour for about 6 months where we talked to various people that were in government and civic educational people throughout the city of Dallas, that then led to forming our Melville Family Foundation. And the mission of the foundation is we exist to improve the lives of Black and brown children in the southern sector of Dallas by focusing on economic empowerment, food insecurity, and academic excellence.
And that's a tough task. And so what was it that made you want to take on such a daunting task?
You know, I'd just like to add to that, because that everything Randy said is absolutely right. And for me, for people not watching, they won't know that we are Black. And it matters here because we have experienced a modicum of success. Randy and I are college graduates, and I've been to graduate school more than one time. And we have been successful with careers and things like that. And still, it was incredibly hard to be the parent of 3 Black sons and getting them through the system that is in place for them to be successful. And for me, I thought, if it is this hard for us, how might it be for people who do not have the resources and access that we enjoy? So then together we thought about and began to have those conversations that Randy is talking about. How is it that we can create impact and go into people's lives maybe and be significant?
And how long ago did you form the foundation?
2018 is when we started the foundation. And to your point, Heather, when you talked about a daunting task, we've learned early on there's a difference between a good idea and a God idea. And the difference is, a God idea is one that you need God to actually put it into existence. And so that's why you see the bigness and the vastness of the task, because we serve the bigness and the vastness of our God. Specifically, when we started is not where we've ended. We started with a singular focus on education. I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, in the inner city. I'm the product of Section 8 housing. And for those who don't know what Section 8 housing is, that's public assistance housing. I happen to have a mother who was a school teacher, and so I learned early on the importance of education and reading. And I learned that I could be in Trenton, New Jersey, but actually have my mind be in Tokyo, in Japan, in Alaska by simply reading. And so that really began my fascination with reading at an early age. And because of that, and as Lael mentioned, we've had great education and been a benefit of that. And so our initial focus in the foundation was just on education. But if I could, a short story that explains why we expanded the foundation. We were doing a Thanksgiving outreach, and we were going to this school, and we were handing out boxes to some families, and some other families were coming in to register. There was a lady who was coming in to register, and it was cold because it was November. And she came in, and Lael went to this lady and said, how you doing? Thanks for coming, et cetera, registering. And then Lael just happened to say, where's your coat? And the lady said, well, we have one coat and my husband has the coat. Lael immediately came in, and I saw she was distraught, and I thought there was a problem or something. And she said, it's unacceptable that this lady doesn't have a coat. So that then led us that we had a coat drive where we asked people to donate moderately used coats, and then we raised money and gave coats to these schools. That then began a broader discussion, quite frankly, on stepping back to see, are we at step 3 as opposed to step 1? And you really can't learn when you're hungry. It was obviously Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so that then began us having our mission statement to be much broader. You can't really have your hunger met if you don't have an economic stability in your home.
And let me jump in there, honey. And I think the other thing that you learn when you are willing to move outside of your comfort zone and step into a new call of God is that you have to ask somebody. If you don't know, you have to ask somebody. And we thought we knew how we could be helpful, but we had to rely on the community that we were serving to tell us what they needed and then to be receptive. And for me, that's the definition of hospitality, that you go into spaces and places and allow it to change you as you work to be of service or a servant in that community. So everybody benefits. It's not just you showing up to do something, but God shows up in you and then does something in you. So, but you are right. We learned because the people we were serving showed us.
And to that point, why don't you amplify a little bit about showing up in service? Talk a little bit about proxemic service and the importance of having our volunteers be in the community.
One of my favorite topics. So when I have relationships with students or other people and we have some closeness, I invite them to read Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. And in it, he has a wonderful definition, and I will just paraphrase it. And basically what he says is that in order for things to be different, to change in dramatic and meaningful ways, is it's important to show up sometimes in those spaces so that you can be changed by those spaces and those spaces will change you. And I guess what we're learning here, even with the podcast, is that we can show up in very different ways. We can show up in person, we can show up online, but you've got to show up. And show up means that you're willing to change and be different and not just what you're comfortable with.
So the title of the podcast is Living on Purpose and Not by Accident. And Randy, you touched on it a bit of really looking for what your purpose was and perhaps what your legacy would be when you were gone. So what was it that humbled you enough to step back and to say, I really need to dig a little deeper. I really need to take a look at what my intent on earth is?
Great question, Heather. And the reality is I was living in a bubble. And I didn't realize I was living in a bubble. We lived in the northern part of Texas. I worked in the northern part of Texas. Our kids went to the northern parts of Texas. We went to church in the northern part of Texas. We went to the theater in the northern part of Texas. It was only when I began to think beyond what I was doing currently. And it was a gentleman, I'll never forget, I was telling him I want to do something in education. And we were talking about doing things outside of work. And he's a very successful white executive, and he was telling me how he spends time in the southern part of Dallas. And he asked me, he says, Randy, well, he was mentioning certain places, and he assumed that I knew the places that he was talking about. And I said, I didn't. And he said, well, Randy, if you want to really make an impact in the community, you should probably go and, just spend some time down there. And that began me asking myself some hard questions around, this is a cohort that I want to serve, but I don't really know anything about the cohort other than I happen to be African American, and that's the community in which I want to serve. We came from totally different backgrounds and different needs. And once I began spending some time down there, Heather, the distance is about a 40-minute with traffic car ride, but it might as well be as distant as Mars is from Earth. And when you spend time in the community, you can look at the difference in lifespans based on zip codes. And it's all empirical data that's easy to get the information. And you begin asking yourself, well, why would that be? Why would someone's life chances be determined by their zip code or by their gender or by their social orientation or sexual orientation? So as I began and Lael and I began really having these discussions, really hard discussions, and it was then putting us in places that we hadn't gone before, really stepping outside of the bubble, really pushing through the boundaries, and back to what I was saying earlier, the difference in a good idea versus a God idea. And God just really laid on our hearts that this is the area that we wanted to make a difference.
Well, and I think also we have a lot of symbiosis and travel time together, but also separately, because he spent a lot of time in corporate America. And for a season, I came home to raise our children. But I think also for me, it's always been, for a long time, it's been a soul matter, how people's hearts were. And even we are very much called to serve underserved and exactly where we are. But I also realize that the soul lags or the soul heaviness and the weight of people is everywhere. And so being called in this space is almost a more obvious way of getting to the needs of people and responding, because some of the things are just easier to respond to, like you need a coat, like you need some food, you need some Wi-Fi. I wrote my more recent dissertation on the digital divide. Did you know that Dallas is one of the top 10 cities for the least amount of connectivity in the United States? So when we went home in the pandemic and when our children were not in school, that meant something in terms of doctor's appointments and learnings. We're still trying to figure out learning loss from those times. So I want to just broaden and then narrow the discussion again, which is people have issues everywhere. But the place that we're called to, and these zip codes that Randy is talking about, referring to, we have one zip code that we are 20 miles away from, that we have the privilege of being in. And there's a 20-year life expectancy difference between the zip codes. So this is unacceptable. This is not God's plan for us. And it is a privilege for us to serve in those very hard spaces that make us cry. So when I felt my husband feeling some kind of way, which I'm glad, because our hearts should always be available to feel something. I feel that too. I mean, I'm also fighting tears, because the work that we do and that we're called to do, it should shake us up. And it should remind us that there is no way that this is going to really happen unless God steps in a powerful way to do a great work.
What I'm struck by in listening to both of you speak is that you did feel a calling, that you felt a purpose behind it. But what was it that took you from that feeling to the action? Because many people watching have those same feelings. They don't know where to start. So what took you from that feeling to then the doing part of it?
I would say for me, it was going back to then go forward. And what I mean by going back, you've heard the expression standing on the shoulder of giants. We don't have time to get into it, but Lael's parents came from a very modest beginning. My parents came from a very modest beginning. And I learned discipline and hard work and all those things from my father, who barely finished high school. And I think of the sacrifices that he made to have a better life for his children. And based on material things, he succeeded in that. But it was more than that. I thought about my father giving blood. It was the blood drive. He would go to give blood when there wasn't blood shortages, just because he thought that was his civic duty. I thought about the overtimes, having 2 and 3 jobs that my father had to provide for the family. And I hadn't reflected, quite frankly, Heather, on those things while I was ascending in corporate America, because I was really thinking about me. And I'd finally got to the point where it wasn't about me. And once I made that switch, it moved from an idea to action. And I would say it was the mind shift change that really caused me and us to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also share our youngest son, Miles, who's all grown up now and getting married next year. He taught me to love superheroes. I am a big time Avengers fan. Oh, what are you talking about? I mean, I really like that. And what I understood, though, is that superheroes are regular people who do extraordinary things. They're regular people, and they're allowed to do extraordinary things. And so I'm figuring that we have the ability, the right, and the desire to do things. And sometimes we are so distracted by ourselves that we forget that we can. And sometimes it's just helpful to see. So I had a superhero in my house too. I mean, he had his father, and I had my father and my mother. And with my dad, I remember coming home and listening on the radio that he had been in a burning building and saved some people. I'm like, is that you? He said, yeah, and it was just, so I had the idea that you could do these things. And then the call to action is really this idea of how can you possibly continue to stand by and watch something die, whether it's a soul or heart or a mind or an idea, really. And then we have the privilege in this capacity to show others how to do it, just as we were shown how to do it by our parents and others. So
there is a huge mental health crisis in this country right now, and it's exacerbated by the things that you're trying to tackle with your foundation. So what do you feel like you're able to do to fix, or to at least try to fix, that crisis?
Yeah, I'd say, Heather, a couple of things. When I think of mental health, unfortunately, it's a topic that's not openly discussed. People suffer in silence. And so I think a couple of things that we try to do very purposefully, very intentionally. One is to model self-care. And Lael and I both work out. I take walks in nature, and I love to read. And so that's my downtime. That's my time to deplug. And so my children know that. I encourage them to do the same thing. So I think it first starts with modeling the right kind of behavior. 1. 2, we want to encourage a space regardless of gender, because I do think with men, it's much more difficult to be vulnerable. just because of how men are socialized. Don't let them see you cry, the toughness, et cetera, on this particular topic that affects, that knows no discrimination on gender, on socioeconomic status, et cetera. I think we're all dealing with this because this is the one time in over 100 years that we've all been impacted by the same thing with the pandemic. So the second thing is encouraging openness to discuss it within our families. And then third, I would say, and it's the pleasure that we have in the space in which we work, we really try to ensure, to the extent that we can, we're bringing other services to the table that address this. That's why I'm so excited about Remy and the work that they're doing, because they're able to take a technology and data to really bring that together to create spaces where people can have their mental health issues addressed. So those are the three things that I would say, and whatever you want to offer.
And then for me, so I've been thinking about this for a while. So my first doctorate is in psychology, and I spent a lot of times in schools and thinking with families, how to be families, and just I worked in a prison system where I worked from minimum to maximum security. So I've just been thinking about mental health for a long time and probably looking at it differently. I can remember as a kid, I'm gonna need you to strap in for this. As a kid, I cared about folks so much. I thought, well, maybe I'm supposed to be a nun because they really love God and they really care about people. So maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. But I never saw any Black nuns, so I didn't think I could be that. So I said, okay, well, I'm gonna have to figure this out. And I just kind of stayed with it for a while. And I found psychology. And psychology means the study of the soul. And I was just trying to figure out, okay, well, how do you love and care for people in a way that brings new life? And I loved being in that space for a long time, and it's a privilege to come alongside people and recognize that there is pain, and they allow you to touch it, and good things can happen. But then there was something that was still missing. And for me, that was the God space. That there are things that clearly we cannot do. As much as the foundation God has provided, and we are doing amazing things, we cannot. And that's the space I believe that God fills. So, but specific to mental health, the challenges have escalated. People have turned in more than turned out. Their ability to have skill sets to manage that has not escalated along with their needs. And so here we find ourselves in this space where we are so glad that we can meet some immediate needs that sometimes help respond to the mental, social, emotional needs.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I have so many more questions. So we would like to have you back for a second episode. I want to dig even deeper into the calling that you have talked about and the ways that you are sharing your gifts, your superpowers with the world. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to talking with you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you. It's been an honor
Heather.
and privilege.
Thank you.